Welcome to the Unveiled Epic Echoes channel. Today, we're diving deep into an unexplored historical mystery. It all begins in a small colonial settlement that almost no one remembers now, tucked between the whispering pines and slow, looping river bends of what would one day become a quiet New England town, the kind of place you might pass through on a long drive and never think about again, though the land has its own long memory and the soil holds stories that never made it into any school book. The settlement was called, a name that sounded grander than the place really was, because it had no harbor, not really, just a lazy river that shivered in the wind and, for much of the year, flowed so gently that the reflections of the trees on the water stayed almost perfectly still, as if even the current were waiting for something that never quite arrived. In the early years, the settlers were like most others you might have read about, weary, hopeful, and haunted in the quiet parts of the night by the lives they had left behind. They raised simple houses of rough-hewn timber, cleared the land in uneven patches, and watched the seasons turn with a mix of anxiety and reverence. Yet would not be remembered for its crops, nor its battles, nor even for any famous figure who passed through. It would improbably be remembered, if at all, for a wooden bench and the extraordinarily long meeting held to decide its length. A gathering that stretched and stretched until it became less a meeting and more a strange sort of vigil, then a ritual, and finally something like a spell cast over the town itself. The story, as it has come down through scattered letters and nearly forgotten local records, begins with a simple idea from a man named Elias Carter, the town carpenter, whose hands carried the quiet confidence of someone who could coax shape and purpose from uncooperative wood. Elias was not a remarkable man on the surface, but he had a steady mind that noticed patterns others missed, and he listened to the land in a way he could never quite explain. One evening, after a long day repairing wagon wheels and mending a broken spinning wheel, he stood before the half-built meeting house at the center of, its frame rising from the ground like a promise, and he imagined a bench along one side of the interior. A single, continuous bench, carved from sturdy local timber, that would run the full length of the wall. He thought it would be a symbol of unity, of everyone in the town having a place to sit, shoulder to shoulder, whenever decisions needed to be made or psalms needed to be sung. He saw, in his mind, children rustling against their mothers' skirts, men leaning forward with work-roughened hands clasped, elders resting their tired bones, all sharing that long bench as if it were a wooden thread stitching them together. So he brought the idea before the council, which was at that time made up of 7 people. Stern-faced Deacon, who always smelled faintly of smoke and pine pitch, widow Abigail Pike, whose sharp eyes missed very little, Noah and Caleb Turner, brothers with opposite tempers but identical eyes, quiet Lydia Hale, who rarely spoke but always watched, Thomas, whose humor often lightened heavy rooms, and Flint, whose hands were perpetually stained with ink from keeping the town's records. Elias presented his proposal at the end of another ordinary meeting, when everyone's thoughts had already begun drifting toward supper. He described the bench as best he could, talking about how it would strengthen the sense of togetherness in their small congregation and provide a simple, lasting comfort. Most of the council responded with polite nods, but it was Deacon who first asked the question that would change everything, though he could not possibly have known it at the time. "And how long?" the deacon asked, rubbing at his beard as the fire crackled low in the hearth. "Do you propose this bench should be?" It should have been a trivial detail, a small technical note easily answered and forgotten. But for some reason the room grew still, and the question hung there, lengthening in the air like a shadow at dusk. Elias had been thinking about something close to the full wall, but he hesitated, because the very moment the question had been asked, another thought slipped in, a fleeting, almost dreamlike memory from his childhood, of sitting with his grandfather on a stone near an old, half-buried foundation far from any traveled road, where the older man had spoken in a low, measured voice about how certain lengths and measures could echo older truths, older patterns. How the ancients had once believed that some proportions harmonized with the turning of the heavens. The settlers did not talk much about such things in. It sounded too close to superstition, too far from the stern practicality that kept them alive. Still, that memory flickered beneath the surface of Elias's mind, and instead of blurting out a number, he found himself answering, "I would need to measure carefully, Deacon. I want it to be exactly right." It was a reasonable answer, but it opened a door no one in that room realized existed. They scheduled a follow-up meeting for the following week to discuss the matter further and to decide, once and for all, on the length of the bench. It seemed laughably minor compared to the challenges of crops and weather and trade. And yet, as the announcement went out, a strange, quiet curiosity began to spread among the townsfolk. It might have been because everyone was exhausted by the relentless seriousness of survival and welcomed any distraction, no matter how small. Or it might have been something else, something older than their reasons, something that lived in the land beneath their feet and the wind that prowled through the tall grass at night. When the evening of the meeting arrived, the unfinished meeting house filled with people far beyond the usual council and elders. Lantern light trembled against the raw wooden beams. The floor creaked under boots and shoes, and the soft shuffle of children's feet as families settled on crude stools, barrels, and makeshift seating. Outside, the sky was a velvety, moonless expanse, and the sound of the river drifting by was almost too soft to hear. The air inside the meeting house was cool and held the smell of green wood, dried herbs, and a little lingering dampness. Flint unrolled a fresh sheet of paper at the small writing table where she kept the minutes, dipping her quill into ink, never imagining just how much she was about to write. Deacon opened the proceedings with a prayer that wandered more than usual, as if even his thoughts were circling some undefined center, and then he turned to Elias. "Mr. Carter," the deacon said, "let us speak plainly. You wish to build a bench. We wish to sit. How long shall this bench be?" Elias had spent the days leading up to the meeting walking the perimeter of the clearing, tracing the dimensions of the meeting house in his mind, measuring with worn ropes and smoothed sticks, and thinking about the strange hints his grandfather had once dropped about ancient measures and the way shadows fell at solstice. He had even, without telling anyone, taken a walk farther upstream along the river to where the ground rose and a ruined stone wall lay partially buried beneath moss and ferns, the place where that childhood memory had been born. There, he had taken some rough measurements and noticed how particular distances seemed to align with the sun at certain times of day, how the stones seemed placed with intention, even if no one now remembered by whom. What he should have done was set all that aside and choose a sensible number based on the width of the wall and the likely number of people who might sit at once. Instead, haunted by the echo of his grandfather's voice and the uncanny feeling that he was brushing against something just out of sight, he said, "We should consider more than just the wall and our own comfort. There are measures that reflect deeper truths in the world, proportions that, so I was once told, mirror the turning of days and seasons, the paths of the sun and stars." The room rustled with a mild, nervous amusement. It was, perhaps, the most unusual opening to what everyone had assumed would be a short, practical exchange. Noah Turner raised a hand halfway, not waiting to be called on. "Are you proposing we measure the heavens to decide whether a man can sit?" he asked, the corners of his mouth twitching. Thomas laughed softly, but it was not unkind. "If it makes the bench strong enough not to throw me on the floor, I'll listen," he said. Yet beneath the joking, something more serious stirred. Their lives were bounded by hard realities, but they also existed in a world where the sky was vast and unspoiled by city light, where stars burned with an almost overwhelming clarity, where the cycles of day and night, planting and harvest, birth and death, were inescapable and awe-inspiring. The idea that a simple bench might, in some quiet, invisible way, be tuned to those rhythms touched a hidden longing in many of them, a desire to belong not only to their small town, but to the larger pattern of the world. And so, instead of dismissing Elias, they asked questions. How might such a length be found? What did his grandfather say? What old measures had he heard of? Elias, feeling his heart beat faintly faster beneath his plain shirt, did his best to answer without sounding foolish. He spoke of how certain ancient cultures were said to have measured distances by the length of shadows cast at particular times of year. How some had used the span from fingertip to fingertip, others the length of a man's stride, still others the circumference of circles traced in the dust beneath the full moon. He admitted he knew only fragments, bits of lore passed down without full context, but he sensed that if they took time to consider the matter carefully, they might create something that, though humble, resonated with a deeper harmony. Most likely, he said, it would come down to matching the bench's length to some meaningful multiple of a common measure. Perhaps the number of days in the year expressed in inches, or a fraction of the river's width at a particular bend, or even the distance from the door of the meeting house to the threshold of the oldest farmhouse. By the time he finished, the room had gone quiet. It was Widow Abigail Pike who finally spoke, her voice dry but not dismissive. "We are tired people in a hard place," she said, "but I have no objection to sitting on a bench that fits snugly in the Lord's pattern, if such a thing can be found." Deacon scratched at his beard again, glancing at who was recording with a slight furrow in her brow. "Very well," he said. "We will not rush to judgment over a piece of furniture. We shall study. We will gather the measures of our lives, our steps, our fields, our river, and see what length appears most fitting. This matter will be held over until we can reconvene with more knowledge." And so, a decision that could have been made in a single sentence was deferred, in the way that decisions sometimes are when people sense that the surface of a question hides deeper water. The next meeting was set for 1 week later. Then, as questions, it was shifted another week, then another, and this simple issue of a bench slowly curled itself around the town's routines like a vine around a post. At first, the investigations were almost playful. Children were sent to count how many strides it took to walk from the large oak at the edge of town to the riverbank. Farmers measured the lengths of their fields with fraying ropes and compared them, wondering if some shared factor would emerge. Lydia Hale, quiet but observant, began to track the shifting positions of the sunrise along the horizon, marking small notches on a beam outside her house. Thomas, more interested in stories than numbers, listened to the tales of the oldest residents about the first clearings, the first trees felled, the way the ground had felt underfoot before houses stood where they did now. These little acts might have faded away, if not for what happened next. One morning, Elias returned to the ruin upstream, the place with the moss-drowned stones and the sense of time sinking into the earth. As he walked the perimeter, he noticed something he had not seen before, or perhaps had seen but not understood. A particular stone, half buried, bore a faint, weather-softened carving. Kneeling, brushing away soil and grit, he realized it formed a simple line etched into the rock, with a short perpendicular stroke at each end, like a primitive measure. Next to it, barely visible unless you caught the angle of the light just right, were 3 small, repeating symbols, circles intersected by a diagonal line. Elias did not know their meaning, but something about them tugged at him like a half-remembered melody. Experimenting, he laid his measuring stick along the etched line and found that its length, by some coincidence or intention, was equal to a certain number of his strides, which in turn roughly matched the distance between 2 supporting beams in the unfinished meeting house. As he walked home, the wind teased the tops of the trees, and he could not shake the sense that he had stumbled onto a thread of something much older even than the stories carried by the settlers across the ocean. At the next meeting, he shared his discovery. The council, despite some skepticism, agreed to investigate the stones themselves. A small group went with him the following day, climbing the gentle rise as the sky carried a pale, washed-out blue. They examined the carving, measured and remeasured, and argued mildly over whether the erosion might have altered its original length. Lydia traced the symbol of the intersected circles with one careful fingertip and mused, more to herself than to the group, that it looked like a wheel and a line crossing its path, like the march of time interrupted. It was Deacon, of all people, who suggested that the length etched into the stone could be used as a kind of base measure in their deliberations about the bench. If this was meaningful to those who came before us, he said, perhaps it can give meaning to what we build now. No one could quite say who had carved the line or why, or even how long ago it had been done, but the idea took hold that their bench might, in some mysterious way, echo a measure recognized by people who had lived there long before cotton and wool and iron nails. So they brought that measure back with them in the form of careful notes and approximations, and over the weeks that followed, they tried to weave it together with the other measures of their world. The lengths of their fields, the distances between houses, the widths of doorways, the span of the river at its narrowest point. Each new piece of information seemed to complicate rather than clarify, and instead of moving toward a single obvious answer, they found themselves entangled in more and more possibilities. Did the bench length need to be a multiple of the stone's measure, or a fraction? Should it align mathematically with the number of people in town, or the number of days in the year, or the cycles of the moon? Each choice implied another. What began as a single evening's agenda item turned gradually into a standing question, returning again and again as the seasons changed, like a refrain in a song they had not quite learned how to sing. The meetings grew longer. Hours passed in slow, patient conversation. They debated whether to make the bench so long that nearly everyone could sit at once, or slightly shorter, so that some would stand and feel more alert. They considered leaving a gap at one end, a symbolic empty space for those who had died or moved away, or for strangers who might come. They charted lengths on crude diagrams, drew lines on scrap wood, walked out proposed dimensions in the clearing, feeling the distances in their bodies as much as in their minds. At some point, though none of them could later agree exactly when, the matter of the bench grew to encompass more than the bench itself. In arguing about measures, they were really asking what kind of town they wished to be, how closely they wanted to follow tradition, how much room they had for curiosity in a life dominated by necessity. The arguments stayed gentle, but they deepened. Noah Turner insisted they should prioritize practicality and cost. Wood was not infinite, and winter burned through firewood quickly. Lydia Hale argued, in her soft way, that if they were going to the trouble to make the bench at all, they might as well give proper weight to the strange harmony of the land's older patterns, even if they did not fully understand them. Widow Pike questioned whether they were being presumptuous in trying to graft their own use onto a measure left by unknown hands. The meetings stretched farther into the night. Lanterns burned low and were refilled. Children nodded off against their mothers' shoulders, lulled by the quiet rhythm of adult voices, the murmur of discussion rising and falling like a tide. The unfinished meeting house became a kind of listening chamber, holding their questions while the world outside continued in its steady way, the river sliding past, the stars wheeling slowly overhead. Time in was still marked by planting and reaping, by births and burials, by storms and thaws. Yet, woven into that rhythm, the question of the bench took on a strange endurance. Weeks became months. The meeting house roof was completed, but the bench remained unbuilt, its absence as notable as any presence might have been. While other towns made quick decisions and moved on, found itself returning again and again to the length of something that did not yet exist, compelled by a sense that, if they chose hastily, they might miss something subtle and important. Over time, the story of the stone measure upstream grew more elaborate. Some said the symbols on the rock matched those seen once on an old fragment of pottery unearthed when digging for a root cellar. Others whispered that on certain evenings, at the edge of twilight, The line etched in the stone seemed to glow faintly, though no one could prove it. A traveling trader claimed that in his journeys, he had seen similar markings on stones far to the south, near ancient mounds whose origins no one could adequately explain. Elias, for his part, felt increasingly as though he had innocently opened a door in a house and discovered, behind it, not a linen closet, but a deep and unknown passage leading into the earth. It gave him an unsettled feeling sometimes, a sense of being drawn into something larger than he had ever intended, yet he could not bring himself to shut the door completely and say, "Let the bench be 8 feet and no more talk." The more they learned, the less simple the question became. As the years rolled quietly past, the meeting about the bench never fully ended. It was adjourned and reconvened, paused for harvesting and resumed when the fields lay bare. New settlers arrived, and after hearing about the ongoing deliberation, found themselves pulled into it, offering fresh opinions and new observations. Children grew into adults who had no memory of a time when the bench had not been under debate. To them, it was simply part of the fabric of life, as constant as the river or the creak of floorboards in winter. What made it all the more peculiar was how gentle it remained. There were no bitter rifts, no shouting matches, no dramatic walkouts. Just a long, uninterrupted conversation that stretched, year after year, across generations. The subject was narrow, yet through it they touched on everything: fairness, tradition, change, the quiet gravity of the land itself. They learned to listen closely, not only to each other, but to the small details of their surroundings. They noticed how certain lengths of timber warped more under humidity than others, and how the river's width at a certain bend matched, almost eerily, the distances they had mapped on parchment. They noticed how people clustered in groups when standing, and how their bodies sought a natural spacing. They began to suspect that the right length for the bench might be less a number and more a feeling, an alignment of comfort and symbolism, and the invisible currents tying them to something ancient. Meanwhile, outside their human concerns, the land held its own deep, slow story. Long before even the people whose carved stones lay moss-covered upstream, the land had been part of a much older world, one where hunters had followed animal tracks along the water, where firelight had flickered against stone walls of shelters now lost to time, where stories had been sung into the night and carried forward by memory alone. Some of those stories had spoken of places of meeting, not so different from this unfinished bench, where people gathered to make decisions about hunting grounds, travel routes, and the distribution of precious resources. In those older stories, the length of a bench or a stone row or a cleared circle was never arbitrary. It was tied, in ways both practical and sacred, to cycles of the sun and moon, to migration of animals, to the length of a hunt, or the distance between water sources. That knowledge, layered over centuries, had faded as people moved on or were displaced, as forests grew and regrew, as languages changed and memories dissolved. Yet some traces remained in the land, like faint echoes in the shape of a hill, the way a stream bent around rock, the worn hollow of a stone where many hands had once rested. When Elias and the council stood at the marked stone upstream, they were brushing against those echoes without fully understanding them. Their ongoing meeting, in all its slow, methodical, sometimes comically tedious detail, became a kind of mirror to the ancient gatherings that had once taken place there. It was as if the land itself, through them, continued its long habit of bringing people together to speak and listen and try to decide how to live. Over time, the meticulous minutes that Flint, and after her, others like her recorded filled ledger after ledger with accounts of the bench debates. They documented proposals, counter-proposals, measurements taken, calculations attempted, patterns suspected, and curiosities noted. Somewhere around the 12th year of the ongoing meeting, one scribe, even knowing it might not be again, began to add small marginal notes about the weather that day, or who had coughed persistently in the back row, or how many times the lantern wick needed trimming. These tiny details, though seemingly unimportant, would someday help anyone reading them feel the human texture of those nights. By the 20th year, if an outsider had wandered into and asked what matter so grave demanded such persistent attention, they might have been surprised to learn it was the length of a bench. Yet, in that answer, lay the heart of something quietly profound. The people of, though they might never have said it this way, had stumbled into a practice of collective contemplation. The bench, always under discussion and never quite concluded, gave them an excuse to gather, to think together without rushing to results, to keep alive a thread of curiosity in lives otherwise ruled by necessity. They still worked hard, still faced illness and storms and lean years. But they also preserved a space where time seemed to stretch and soften, where decisions were neither forced nor abandoned, just held and examined from many angles. The irony, of course, was that when they finally did converge on an answer, if the scattered records and later are to be believed, it happened almost by accident. It was a late autumn evening, the air outside sharp with the smell of distant wood smoke and damp leaves. The harvest had been modest but adequate, and there was a collective sense of tiredness in the room as they gathered for yet another installment of the bench discussion. Many of the original council members had passed away. New faces now sat in their places, though some families had maintained a continuous presence. The stone measure upstream had been measured and remeasured, and its length converted into so many ratios and units that even the numbers had begun to feel weary. On this particular night, a distant storm was rolling in, and the occasional low rumble of thunder underscored their conversation. A young woman named, a descendant of Elias Carter, rose to speak, not with a new calculation or theory, but with something simpler. She had grown up listening to the debates as background music to her childhood, the murmur of voices a kind of lullaby. She knew the arguments well enough to predict them, yet she was also aware, more keenly than most, of the quiet burden of never concluding. "We have honored this question," she said, her voice steady and clear, "for longer than anyone living remembers it not being asked. We have listened to the land, the river, the sky, the stones, and to one another. Perhaps the length we seek has never been a fixed distance at all, but a measure of how long we have been willing to sit with the unknown. Our ancestors gathered here, as we do, under this roof and under these stars, and we have turned this simple bench into a vessel for their echoes and the echoes of those before them. I propose that we choose a length that is not perfect by any calculation, but simply feels right when we lay the boards on the floor and stand beside them. Let the measure be this moment, here and now, with everyone present. Let the bench be, as long as the bodies in this room naturally span, when we stand side by side and breathe together." It was not a mathematical argument, nor did it reference the ancient stone or the river's width or the cycles of the moon. It was grounded in the present, in the felt reality of their shared space. Perhaps they were simply tired enough, or perhaps they had reached a kind of collective wisdom that only comes when a question has been carried for a very long time. Either way, something in the room shifted. The usual objections did not rise. Instead, the deacon, this one the grandson of the original, nodded slowly and said, "Then let us stand." One by one, the townspeople rose and formed a line along the wall where the bench was meant to be. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their breath mingling, their bodies forming a human measure. Children squeezed between parents, elders leaned lightly on younger arms, and the line extended until it reached a natural stopping point near the far corner of the room. Someone laid a length of rope along their feet, stretching it from the first to the last. When everyone sat down again and the rope was measured, its length settled into a simple, unremarkable number by the standards of their old calculations. It was not a perfect multiple of the stone's measure, nor did it align neatly with the days of the year or the phases of the moon. Yet as they looked at the figures and at each other, there was a gentle, collective sense of yes, of enough. The decision was taken with far less debate than any of them would have thought possible. They recorded the number in the minutes, a line in a ledger already swollen with earlier entries, and closed the book with a soft thump. The meeting, in some sense, had finally ended after years of being extended. In the weeks that followed, the bench was built. Elia's descendants chose strong, straight boards and smoothed them carefully, running their hands along the grain until the wood felt almost like fabric. They joined the planks and supports with quiet care, not hurrying, yet no longer held back by hesitation. When it was installed along the wall, there was a small ceremony, nothing elaborate, just a gathering on a clear afternoon where the light slanted through the windows and dust motes drifted lazily in the air. People sat on the bench for the first time, shifting a little, feeling the give of the wood, the way it cradled or resisted their weight. It felt, as such things often do, both completely ordinary and quietly momentous. And then something almost comically simple happened. Life moved on. The bench, for all the years of discussion that had produced it, gradually settled into the background. People sat on other stools or stood at the back out of habit. Children preferred the floor, where they could doodle with bits of chalk or play finger games. The bench was used occasionally, of course, but never became central in the way Elias had once imagined. It was as if the true purpose of the whole endeavor had not been to create a frequently occupied object, but to give the town a long, shared experience of thinking and listening together. Within a generation, the story of the world's longest meeting, if it could indeed claim that title, began to soften around the edges. Newer concerns took precedence, and while elders still told the tale of how the bench length had been debated for years, it was often met with indulgent smiles or rolled eyes from those who felt they had more pressing problems. Yet, tucked away in the town's simple archives, the ledgers of Flint and her successors quietly survived, their ink faded but legible. The stone upstream remained where it had always been, moss reclaiming parts of the carved line, the symbols weathering further under rain and snow. The bench itself, despite not being used nearly as much as intended, held up remarkably well, its wood aging with a sort of stubborn dignity. Travelers from other towns occasionally came through and heard, in passing, about the bench and the years of discussion behind it. Some laughed at the absurdity. Others, especially those who had felt the rush and pressure of places where decisions were made quickly, sometimes viciously, found the tale oddly comforting. Over the centuries, as the land changed hands and names, as towns rose and fell and roads were carved where footpaths had once been, this bench slowly slipped from general knowledge. The meeting houses of that time were renovated, repurposed, or replaced. Families moved away, carrying fragments of stories with them like small seeds. Some of those seeds took root far from their origin, turning into brief, curious references in local lore. The town that debated a bench for an entire generation, the people who listened more than they spoke. Eventually, even those mentions grew rare. By the time historians in later eras combed through regional records looking for dramatic events, battles, famines, notable births, they skimmed past the dense pages of bench meeting minutes with little interest. They were too detailed, too mundane, and the subject seemed too trivial to warrant attention in a world more fascinated by grander narratives. And so's Great, Gentle Meeting, the extraordinarily boring tale of how early American settlers held the world's longest meeting to decide the length of a wooden bench no one ever really used, slipped into obscurity. Yet the land, as it always does, remembered. On certain evenings, when the light is just right and someone happens to be walking along a quiet river in a quiet corner of New England, there is still a feeling, hard to put into words, that lingers in the air. It is a softness, a sense that decisions need not always be rushed, that some questions can be carried patiently until the answer finally settles upon you like a feather drifting down. In that feeling lies the true legacy of a legacy passed not through monuments or famous names, but through the deeper currents of how people gather, how they sit together in shared silence and slow conversation, how they allow themselves to consider even the smallest of things with reverence. In another time, perhaps not far from where that original bench once stood, you might imagine a modern listener, maybe someone like you, settling down at the end of a long day. The room is dim, the hum of distant traffic a gentle murmur, and outside a breeze combs through the leaves of trees whose ancestors once watched those settlers come and go. The story of and its endless meeting drifts into that room like a soft, steady river of words, carrying you with it. You can almost see the lantern-lit faces in the old meeting house, the careful hands measuring rope and wood, the quiet debates that never rose to anger, only circled patiently around a shared curiosity. You can imagine the stone upstream, its carved line now worn but not erased, still catching the evening light in a way that hints at distant, forgotten hands. You can feel, if you let yourself, the way their long, gentle decision-making echoes across time, offering a counterpoint to the rush of your own world. It suggests, in its modest way, that some part of being human has always involved sitting with questions longer than seems strictly necessary, listening for deeper patterns, and accepting that not all answers will feel perfectly logical or complete. As you listen, your breathing may slow. Your thoughts, which earlier jumped from worry to worry, begin to stretch out and soften, drawn into the spaciousness of a story where nothing terrible happens, where the drama is quiet and the stakes, though meaningful, remain gentle. The names of the settlers, Elias, Lydia, Noah, Abigail, drift like leaves on water, becoming less distinct and more soothing. The sound of the river blends, in your imagination, with whatever soft noises surround you now, forming a comfortable background hum. The bench, so long debated and so seldom used, becomes almost a symbol of your own right to rest, to sit without needing to explain or justify. Perhaps in the unseen architecture of your inner world, there is a bench like that too, a place shaped by years of thought, built slowly while you weren't paying much attention, waiting quietly along the wall of your mind for you to lean back and simply be. If you look closely enough, you might even feel the presence of other, older stories braided into this one, the way the settlers, question-echoed gatherings long before them. You might sense people from ancient times sitting in circles near other rivers, arguing with equal seriousness about how big a fire should be, or how wide a path must remain, or how many stones to stack in a line to mark a meaningful place. Their concerns, so distant and particular, become strangely universal when viewed from the soft vantage point of sleepiness. They too needed to rest. They too wrestled with choices that mattered deeply to them, and not at all to the wide, indifferent sky. And as you float on that realization, your own worries may seem to grow lighter, not because they vanish, but because they find their place in a much larger, ongoing conversation across centuries. At some point, without quite knowing when it happens, the details of bench blur at the edges the way lantern light smears when your eyelids droop. The precise length they chose no longer matters, not really. What remains is the feeling of a small community that gave itself the rare gift of time, of a land that held their questions the way a gentle cupped hand holds water, and of the quiet understanding that even the most extraordinarily boring tale can carry, beneath its surface, a deep and steady peace. That peace is what lingers as your thoughts drift further away, as the world of the story grows hazy and distant, leaving behind only the steady murmur of the unseen river, and the soft creak of an old wooden bench in a room where the meeting has finally ended, where everyone has gone home, and where evening light fades into a quiet, comforting dusk. In that fading light, you are free to rest, to let go, to let the long, gentle echo of their voices carry you into sleep, knowing that the questions of your day, like theirs, can be set down for a while to be picked up again, slowly, patiently, when the time is right. The evening after the long-awaited decision on the bench, long after the last lantern in the meeting house had been extinguished and the townsfolk had drifted back to their homes, a quiet stillness settled over, the kind of stillness that feels like a held breath. The river, steady and unhurried, slid past the banks as it had for centuries, murmuring its old, steady songs to the night air. In the soft darkness, something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the subtle weight of forgotten memory rising to the surface after a long sleep. The newly built bench, simple and unadorned, rested against the meeting house wall. In the dimness, it seemed almost to hum with the warmth of the hands that had shaped it, the feet that had stood beside it, the voices that had debated its very existence for longer than anyone living could truly grasp. It carried the imprint of all that thought, all that time, all those careful breaths drawn in lantern-lit rooms. Yet something older stirred beneath it. Long before existed, long before Elias Carter or the deacon or the stone etched with mysterious symbols, there had been another gathering on the same land. Another long, slow meeting, though not of settlers, and not within the walls of any building. The ancient people who once lived along this river carried stories in bone, in earth, in carved wood and shaped stone. They believed that certain places breathed more deeply than others, that some corners of the world held layers of memory that could guide decisions if one listened quietly enough. They gathered under open sky, listening to wind patterns, watching how birds flew low before storms, and marking time by how shadows crawled across certain stones. These people had once placed a long row of wooden seats, more like low platforms, along the bend of the river. Archaeologists many generations later, digging without knowing what they sought, would find only faint soil discolorations where post holes once stood, unable to fully reconstruct the meaning of the arrangement. But the ancient community knew. They had sat on those platforms during long councils that lasted days, sometimes weeks, sometimes entire seasons, speaking softly about harvests, migrations, storms, and the dreams of their hunters and seers. They believed that decisions made slowly, in rhythm with the turn of the sun and moon, carried the blessing of the land itself. Over time, storms and countless winters carried those wooden seats away. The forest reclaimed them, the river softened their edges, and even the memory of them slipped into sleep. But the land, alive in its own quiet way, never truly forgot. So when the settlers of debated their bench for so many years, the land recognized this familiar pattern, this gentle patience. It listened, as it had listened long ago, and the slow cadence of their voices became part of the soil, dreaming again. On the night after the bench was built, as the moon drifted behind a veil of thin clouds, Lydia Hale found herself unable to sleep. Something pulled her from her bed, a faint tug in her chest, like the quiet insistence of a half-remembered lullaby. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped into the cool night. The grass whispered beneath her feet, dew gathering at the edges of each blade. Fireflies hovered in slow arcs, their soft glows drifting like wandering thoughts. Without knowing why, she walked toward the river. The path was familiar, worn by years of footsteps, yet tonight it felt different, as if the ground had softened its voice to invite her closer. She reached the bend where the ruined stone lay, the one Elias had found, and knelt beside it. The carved line, worn by time, caught what little starlight filtered through the clouds. Lydia touched it gently, letting her fingers rest in the shallow groove. She closed her eyes, breathing slowly, letting her thoughts float without direction. And then she felt it. Not a voice, not a vision, but a sensation like warm water rising gently around her. Not physical, but deeply present. It was as though the land itself was remembering aloud, tracing old memories through her mind, whispering of gatherings long before hers, of councils under open sky, of long benches made not for comfort, but for belonging. Lydia's breath deepened. She felt her heartbeat slow, settling into a rhythm she had never consciously noticed before, steady, grounding, ancient. She felt, too, the presence of those who had sat here before her, not as ghosts but as gentle echoes. She felt their patience, their reverence for slow thinking, their understanding that decisions made without haste settled more deeply into the world. She did not know how long she remained there, minutes, hours, or something in between. Time softened around her like a fatting shoreline. Eventually, when she opened her eyes again, the clouds had drifted aside and a wide stretch of stars hung above her, bright and calm. She returned to town with a quiet certainty that something about the bench, its length, its placement, its purpose, had awakened a memory older than any of them. She did not share this with the council immediately. She understood instinctively that some truths reveal themselves slowly, like ripples in still water. In the days that followed, others felt subtle shifts as well. Elders reported dreams of endless wooden platforms along a riverbank, lit by the soft glow of ancient fires. Children woke with strange phrases on their tongues, sounds that echoed no English words, but carried a rhythm that felt intentional and peaceful. Farmers noticed patterns in the way mist gathered along the fields at dawn, forming gentle curves that reminded them of the bench's long silhouette. Elia's descendants, while tending their tools or repairing doorframes, sometimes paused with a sudden awareness that their hands were moving in rhythms older than the craft they'd learned, guided by something softer than memory. The bench became, quietly, a place where people sat not for meetings or decisions, but simply to rest. Some swore they felt calmer there, as though the wood carried an old, soothing breath that helped their thoughts unwind. Others sat on it during restless nights, letting the silence wrap around them until their worries dissolved like mist under the rising sun. The more they sat, the more the bench itself seemed to deepen in meaning, not because it was used frequently, but because it had become a kind of threshold between the hurried questions of daily life and the ancient patience of the land. As decades passed, even as changed, grew, and eventually faded into history, the deep quiet woven into that bench drifted through generations, carried not through records or monuments, but through the almost invisible chain of human comfort. Long after the original bench was lost to time, whether by fire, renovation, or simple decay, its memory remained in the way people spoke about sitting together under dim light, listening more than speaking, waiting for answers to rise naturally like dawn over distant hills. Some modern scholars, digging through forgotten archives, would stumble across Flint's dense ledgers and laugh softly at the thought of a town spending years deciding the length of a single piece of furniture. But a few, the ones who read slowly and listened to the spaces between the words, would sense something else there, a kind of ancient wisdom concealed inside an extraordinarily boring tale. They would wonder why such a trivial matter had compelled so many people for so long. They would feel, buried in the dust of those pages, the heartbeat of an older world. And if they ever traveled to the quiet bend of the river, now overgrown with willows and thick grass, they might feel a faint hum in their chest, a soft resonance with the land beneath their feet. They might sit on a fallen log or a smooth stone and notice their breathing deepen, unbidden. They might sense the presence of long, unbroken gatherings, both ancient and colonial, layered beneath the soil. They might close their eyes and listen, truly listen, and feel the world slowing around them, easing them into a restfulness older than language. And in that soft, drifting moment, they might understand that the story of endless meeting was never really about a bench. It was about time itself, and how human beings, when allowed to move slowly and think gently, become part of something far wider than their own small days. In that understanding lies a rare comfort, the comfort of belonging to a pattern that stretches across centuries, the comfort of knowing that even the quietest decisions carry echoes deeper than we know, the comfort of realizing that rest is not wasted time, but ancient practice. And as those thoughts drift like slow-moving clouds across the inner sky of the mind, a deep softness gathers, pulling one gently toward sleep, where the steady rhythm of the unseen river and the quiet hum of forgotten counsels merge into a single, soothing lullaby. As years folded quietly into decades, and the memory of individual faces blurred like ink left too long in the rain, the subtle legacy of took a different path than anyone there could have predicted. slipping not into recorded history, but into something more spacious and invisible, like a gentle current flowing beneath the surface of time. And the story of the bench, that long-debated, seldom-used piece of wood, became a kind of whisper that occasionally surfaced where people gathered slowly. Where conversations lingered, where decisions were not forced but allowed to ripen in their own time. Somewhere generations later, in a small New England town that had seen mills rise and fall, where the river now flowed past crumbling stone foundations and rusted iron remains of old industry, a modest local library stood on a quiet street, its stone steps worn smooth by countless footsteps. The town was no longer called. That name had drifted away like a leaf in the current, replaced by something newer that fit better on maps and legal documents. But the land was the same, the river was the same, and somewhere deep beneath the sidewalks and houses, the patient memory of gatherings remained. In the library, tucked away on a high shelf that few people reached without a ladder, sat a box of brittle documents labeled in fading ink. Early colonial records, undated, miscellaneous. For a long time, no one opened it. Dust gathered in its corners. The box traveled, as libraries do, through different hands and renovations, carried from one building to another when the town expanded its public spaces. Its contents never fully read, always secondary to more pressing tasks. And then, on a rainy autumn afternoon, a graduate student named arrived from a distant university with a research grant and a quiet fascination for small histories, for the odd, overlooked corners of the past that never made it into textbooks. Had the kind of tired curiosity that comes from long hours spent in archives, reading between the lines of lives long gone. She liked the way old paper smelled, the faint scent of dust and time. She liked how every sentence written centuries ago carried, in the shape of its letters, the ghost of a hand, of a heartbeat. When the local librarian, a kindly older woman named Ruth, gestured vaguely at the high shelf and said, "You might find something interesting up there in that old colonial box, though I can't promise it's organized," something in perked up. She fetched a rolling ladder, climbed carefully, and brought the box down. The cardboard was soft at the edges, tape yellowed and curling. She opened it on a long wooden table by the window, where the rain streaked down the glass in slow, uneven lines. Inside, she found bundles of papers tied with fraying string, pages of reports, inventories, a short, fatting letter about a lost cow, some minor land disputes, and then, wrapped more carefully than the rest, a ledger with a cracked leather cover. The first pages were plain enough. Attendance lists, accounts of meetings about crops, building repairs, and small agreements among settlers. But as she read further, the content shifted. There, in neat, compact handwriting, she found the first mention. Discussion regarding the proposed bench along the meeting house wall and the possible implications of its length upon the harmony of our gathering. She frowned a little, then smiled. It was oddly charming that a community had recorded discussions about furniture with such seriousness. She kept reading, and page after page revealed long, detailed notes about measurements taken at the river, the mysterious stone upstream, ratios considered and discarded, debates over whether to mirror the days of the year or the phases of the moon. The deeper she read, the more astonished she became at the sheer length of the deliberation. Years rolled by in the ledger's entries, all circling around the bench. Other matters were mentioned in passing: storms, illnesses, births, supply shortages. But somehow, always, the record returned to the bench, to its length, to its symbolic weight, to the question of whether human-made objects should echo deeper patterns in the world. The story unfolded gently, methodically, as if the person taking the minutes believed that every small step of the conversation was worth preserving. There was something almost hypnotic about the repetition. Sat with the ledger for hours, listening to the quiet tapping of rain against the window, feeling the world outside soften into gray. Names appeared again and again. Elias Carter, Flint, Lydia Hale, the Turners, the Deacons. She followed them as they aged, as their handwriting changed, as their titles shifted from young man to elder. She watched entire lifetimes pass, anchored by a single, unresolved question about a bench. It was, by any conventional standard, mind-numbingly uneventful. And yet, as she read, she began to feel a strange calm move through her, like the slow exhale at the end of a deep breath. There was no war here, no drama, no grand betrayal. There was only the patient weaving of human minds around a shared, harmless obsession. It made the noise of her own life, the deadlines, the career anxieties, the constant churn of information, seemed distant and small. That night, at the Modest Inn where she was staying, dreamed of the bench. She saw it under construction, saw Elia's hands smoothing the wood, saw dipping her quill by lantern light. But her dream did not stop there. It drifted further back, past the settlers, to a night thousands of years earlier, when people who spoke another language entirely sat on long, low platforms by the river, their faces lit by firelight. They were silent, just listening, to the crackle of flames, to the whisper of the water, to the quiet undercurrent of their own thoughts. No one in the dream seemed anxious to speak. Decisions, in that scene, felt like stones settling gently into place at the bottom of a stream. When she woke, just before dawn, the room was dim and quiet. The glow from the streetlight outside painted gentle lines on the ceiling. Lay still, listening to her own breathing, feeling the echo of the dream like a warm hand on her shoulder. She did not know, and would never scientifically prove, that her dream had anything to do with the ancient people who had once lived there. But she felt, in an unguarded, sleepy way, that she had brushed against something that belonged not to any one name or era, but to the land itself. A habit of gathering, of sitting, of thinking slowly that had been reenacted again and again across centuries. Over the following days, she went back to the ledger repeatedly. When her official research task became tedious or frustrating, she would return to those pages about the bench, letting her eyes trace the steady march of dates and discussions. She noticed how the tone of the record keepers softened over time, how they began to insert little observations. It was a cold evening, the lantern smoked. Or, Lydia spoke little tonight, but her eyes were very bright. Or, we spent more time listening than talking. No resolution yet, but no impatience either. These small details soothed her, like a steady rhythm in a piece of music. The story unfolded not with sudden twists, but with the quiet assurance of a river continuing to flow, no matter what clutter floated briefly on its surface. When she finally reached the entry about Elia's descendant, and her suggestion that the bench length be determined by the bodies standing side by side, felt a soft ache in her chest. Here, after so many years of calculation, the answer arrived as something simple, human, embodied. It was not a victory of mathematics or mystical alignment, but of presence. People standing together in a room, breathing together, letting their shared existence define the measure. The ledger recorded the resolution briefly, almost matter-of-factly. The number chosen was written neatly in the margin. No one circled it or underlined it. Yet the next page contained a line that found herself reading again and again. The meeting tonight ended not with great triumph, but with a quiet sense of sufficiency, as if a long-held breath had at last been released. She that sentence into her notebook, not for any formal citation, but because she wanted to carry it with her like a small, smooth stone. In the evenings after leaving the library, she would walk by the river, trying to guess where the old meeting house had stood, where the bench might once have rested, where the carved stone upstream might still lie. The modern town had reconfigured the landscape, but the water was constant, moving with the same patient pace it had always known. Sometimes she sat on a bench by the riverbank, not the historic one, just a modern park bench, letting the sound of water blur her thoughts. She would think about the long meeting in, about how something so seemingly boring could hold such gentle power. It felt like a lullaby disguised as bureaucracy, like a bedtime story written in minutes and motions. As the sun slid down and streetlights flickered on, she would feel her shoulders loosen, her jaw unclench. The world's frantic urgency dulled at the edges, replaced by the image of lantern-lit gatherings where people took years to decide a simple matter, and yet harmed no one in the process. One drizzly afternoon, as her time in the town was drawing to a close, she sat at the library table with the ledger in front of her and felt a sudden urge to write. Not an academic paper, not yet, but something softer, more personal. She pulled out a blank sheet and began to write, in slow, looping lines, the story of as she understood it now. A community that had, by accident or instinct, recreated an ancient practice of slow counsel. A land that had hosted patient meetings across. A bench that had become a symbol of time taken, rather than time wasted. She wrote about how the tale had quietly soothed her own restless mind. How it had reminded her that not every question needed an immediate answer. That there was a certain kindness in letting decisions unfold at the pace of breath and heartbeat, rather than the ticking of clocks and the ping of notifications. The more she wrote, the calmer she felt, as though the act of putting these thoughts into words was itself a kind of long, gentle meeting between past and present, between the land and her own small life. When she finished, she closed her notebook slowly and pressed her palm to the ledger's worn pages in a simple, private gesture of thanks. She knew that, to most people, this story would sound uneventful, almost comically dull. But she suspected that some, especially those carrying too much noise in their heads, might find comfort in its extraordinary lack of catastrophe. It was, in a way, a love story, between a community and time, between people and the land that held their questions. Years later, back at her university, would occasionally use the bench story in her lectures, not as a primary research subject, but as a gentle aside when students grew tense over exams or deadlines. She would tell them, in her calm, measured voice, about a town that once took decades to decide the length of a bench, and how, in the process, they discovered a deeper way of listening. She would describe the ledgers, the stone upstream, the quiet dreams. And every time, she would notice a few students relaxing visibly in their seats, their shoulders dropping, their eyes softening, as if the story had untangled a knot they had not known they were carrying. Some nights, when herself had trouble sleeping, she would close her eyes and imagine the meeting house inn. She would picture the wooden beams, the glow of lanterns, the murmur of voices. She would see Lydia walking to the river in the dark, standing to speak, ink-stained fingers, Elia's tracing the carved stone. She would imagine herself there too, not as a scholar, but as a quiet observer seated somewhere near the back, feeling the gentle rhythm of the discussion wash over her like tidewater. In that imagined room, nothing terrible ever happened. No one raised their voice in rage. No sudden disaster forced a hurried decision. There was only time to listen, time to think, time to breathe. As she sank into that vision, her own breathing would deepen, and sleep would eventually come, as gently as a leaf settling on the surface of a pond. And you, listening now in your own time and place, might find yourself drifting into that same room in your mind's eye, a space warmed by unseen lanterns, smelling faintly of wood and ink, where a group of ordinary people allowed themselves the rare luxury of slowness. You may picture the bench, long and simple, resting against the wall like a quiet promise. You may imagine the people who once debated its length walking home through the night air, their footsteps soft on the packed earth, their hearts lightened by the knowledge that not everything had to be finished all at once. The world outside your window may be filled with noise and urgency, but in this story's gentle current, those sounds grow more distant, less demanding. The questions of your day, like the bench question in, do not need to be solved all at once. They can be set down for a while, held lightly instead of gripped. They can wait as long as you need them to. As your thoughts stretch out and soften, the river of the story carries you further downstream, away from the sharp edges of worry and toward a wide, calm bend where voices speak quietly and then fall silent, where lanterns burn low and then are gently extinguished. where a long, simple bench, shaped by many hands and many years of patient attention, stands in a room that no longer needs to host the world's longest meeting because, at last, it is time to rest. And in that spacious quiet, you are invited to rest as well, to let your mind recline on its own invisible bench, to let the slow, steady current of time carry you, unhurried, into a deep and peaceful sleep. As continued her research in the years that followed, even as life tugged her into new obligations and new cities, she found that the story of stayed with her in subtle ways, surfacing at moments of uncertainty, settling softly in her thoughts like a feather drifting slowly onto still water. Sometimes it came to her while she was standing in a crowded subway car, surrounded by the noise of conversation and the metallic drone of wheels on tracks. Sometimes it appeared when she was sitting alone in a park with a book open on her lap, but her mind far from its pages. Sometimes it arrived in the quiet hours before dawn, when the world felt suspended between dreams and waking, when she would lie still beneath the faint glow of streetlight filtering through her curtains and feel the soft echo of the old meeting house, the lanterns flickering in the dark. In those moments, she would imagine the people of taking their seats again, settling into the slow rhythm of their long deliberations. She would see their faces lined by hard winters and long summers, but softened by the gentle companionship of shared questions. Their voices would rise and fall like wind moving through pine branches, never hurried, never sharp. The older she grew, the more came to understand that there was something profoundly soothing about a story with no real conflict, where the central drama revolved around an object as humble as a bench. In her own world, filled with deadlines, decisions, and the constant pressure to know things quickly, the quiet persistence of meeting felt like a reminder of a different way of being, a slower, more deliberate rhythm that human beings once understood instinctively, before the modern world filled every empty space with noise. Years after her visit to the library, returned to the region for a conference. The town where had once stood had changed again, shaped by new businesses, new roads, and new people who rarely thought about the land's deeper history. But the river still wound its way through the landscape with the same patient curves, and on her free afternoon, she felt a soft tug inside her, an almost magnetic pull toward the water's edge. She walked along a quiet path lined with ash and maple trees, the leaves rustling softly overhead. The afternoon sun filtered through the branches in warm, shifting patterns that reminded her of lantern light on old wooden beams. Eventually, she reached a small clearing near the river, where a few stones jutted out of the earth at strange angles. She paused, recognizing the shape of the land, even though centuries of growth had altered its appearance. This was where had gathered, where the old meeting house had stood, where the bench had rested, where Lydia Hale had walked on that moonlit night so long ago, drawn by a sense she could not name. Sat down on one of the flat stones, closing her eyes. The river whispered steadily beside her, its voice old and unhurried. When she breathed in, she smelled damp earth, moss, and the faint sweetness of decaying leaves. When she exhaled, she felt tension draining from her shoulders in long, steady waves. For a long time, she simply sat there, letting the quiet settle around her like a familiar blanket. Then, slowly, gently, she began to feel something. Nothing dramatic or supernatural, just a soft awareness, a deep, calming hum beneath the surface of things, as if the land itself were breathing. She imagined the ancient people who had gathered here thousands of years earlier, sitting on wooden platforms beside the river, listening to the crackle of firelight and the soft-footed animals moving just beyond the circle of warmth. She imagined the settlers of, walking through the dusk to the meeting house, their boots whispering over the packed earth, their lanterns swaying in their hands, their minds prepared for another long evening of slow discussion. And she imagined all the people who had passed across this land since then, farmers, tradespeople, children chasing each other through the fields, travelers pausing to drink from the river, historians reading dusty pages without realizing how deeply those pages connected them to the soil beneath their feet. As she sat with these impressions, felt a soft warmth in her chest, not unlike the feeling she had experienced in the library when she first read the line about sufficiency. It was a warmth that said, "You are part of this too." Not in any grand historical sense, but in the way a person becomes part of a story simply by listening to it, by caring about it, by carrying it forward in quiet ways. When she finally rose to leave, the sun had slipped lower in the sky, turning the river into a long ribbon of pale gold. Her footsteps were unhurried, mirroring the gentle cadence of the story she had come to love. And as she walked, she found herself thinking about something that had never appeared explicitly in the ledger, but had always been present in its tone. That the act of gathering, of speaking and listening without urgency, is itself a kind of restful ritual. A meeting does not have to be about resolving something. Sometimes it can simply be about witnessing time with others, letting thoughts unfold at the pace of breath. Over the years that followed, told the story of not just to her students, but to friends, to colleagues, to family members who found themselves weighed down by the relentless pace of modern life. She always told it slowly, letting each detail settle gently in the air. And she noticed that wherever she told it, whether in a classroom, over a dinner table, or during a long walk in the woods, the people listening always fell quiet after a while, their shoulders lowering, their breathing deepening, their thoughts softening into a calmer shape. It was as though the old meeting have extended its steady influence across time, offering a slow, quiet refuge to anyone who let themselves drift into its rhythm. She sometimes wondered what became of the original bench. Perhaps it had been dismantled, repurposed into firewood or furniture. Perhaps it had fallen apart slowly, its wood softening under the weight of decades of humidity and insect life, returning inch by inch to the forest floor. Perhaps, though unlikely, some part of it still rested beneath the soil near the river, waiting to be rediscovered by someone who would not understand its significance at first glance, but realized that it didn't truly matter whether the physical bench survived. What mattered was the shape of its story, the way it had stretched itself out across generations, a quiet, patient thread reminding people that even the slowest, simplest acts of human fellowship carry meaning. In the deep quiet of her mind, especially during sleepless nights, she could still picture it clearly. The long wooden seat, smooth from careful hands, resting against the wall of a meeting house filled with the gentle murmur of voices. She could hear the soft rustling of wool sleeves, the crackle of lantern wicks, the faint wind pressing against the wooden walls. She could feel the warm presence of people sitting together in companionable silence, thinking not of conclusions, but of possibilities. Over time, something inside her began to change. The story of softened her edges, reshaped her days. She found herself rushing less, speaking more deliberately, listening with greater patience. She discovered that many decisions she once felt pressured to make quickly could actually be left to settle a little longer, allowed to ripen in their own time like fruit on a branch. And in this shift, she felt a strange, comforting connection to all those long-ago voices who had once sat in that lantern-lit room, debating something as simple and profound as the length of a wooden bench. She realized that story was not only a tale about the past, but a quiet instruction for the present. That slowness is not the enemy of progress, that careful thought is not a weakness, that even the most mundane questions can carry beauty when held with patience. And so the story continued, not only in her lectures or her notes or her academic work, but in the calm, steady rhythm of her own life. And even further, through her, the story drifted silently into the lives of others. A student, years later, would find themselves returning to the memory of the bench during a stressful night, using its gentle cadence to steady their breath. A friend who had trouble sleeping would think of the river, the lanterns, the long meeting house, and feel the quiet tug of rest. A colleague would remember the tale during a long conference, finding comfort in the idea that not everything needs to be resolved quickly. The story of Once Nearly Lost in a Forgotten Box became a kind of hidden lullaby, whispered from one tired mind to another across time. And now, as it drifts to you, wherever you are in a dim room on a quiet evening, with the sounds of your own life softening in the background, the story reaches once more toward that same gentle purpose. You may feel your breath deepen, your thoughts slow, your body settle into its own quiet space. You may sense the warm glow of the old meeting house lanterns flickering softly behind your eyelids. You may hear, somewhere in the distance of your imagination, the steady murmur of a river older than memory. And as you drift in that soothing current, the questions of your day loosen their grip, becoming as weightless as the soft mist rising from the water. There is nothing to do now, nowhere to hurry to. Only the slow, gentle unfolding of a story meant to guide you into rest, like the long, patient meeting that once carried an entire community into the quiet heart of time. As the years passed and grew older, her relationship with the story deepened in ways she never quite expected. At first, it had felt like a curiosity, then a comfort, and eventually it became something closer to a companion. Silent, patient, always waiting in the background of her mind like a familiar melody that could be hummed without thinking. Even when she spent entire seasons focused on other research, other publications, other projects that demanded sharper analysis and quicker velocity, she would still find herself drifting back to the quiet ledger pages, the lantern-lit meetings, the patient river winding through the forest, and the long-forgotten bench that had once held the attention of an entire community. Sometimes, during long nights when deadlines pressed too tightly against her thoughts, she would imagine the people of sitting once more in their old meeting house, taking their seats slowly, settling into the gentle rhythm of unhurried discussion. Their voices would begin like soft ripples in a pond, spreading outward in calm, concentric waves that eased the tension in her chest and quieted the restless pace of her thoughts. And in those imagined scenes, the settlers were joined by others, students she had taught over the years, strangers she had once seen reading late at night in the library, people who had carried burdens heavier than they knew how to voice. They all found a place along the wall, near the simple wooden bench, as though the story had become large enough to shelter anyone who needed to rest inside it. In this way, the bench slowly became more than a historical curiosity. In's mind, and increasingly in the minds of those she shared the story with, it transformed into a kind of quiet symbol, a place where time moved differently, where thought could stretch out like the slow arc of a river bend and find its natural shape without pressure or expectation. But the story did not stop there. History, like water, has a way of finding cracks and flowing through them, carrying small particles of the past forward into places where they settle in new and unexpected forms. And so it happened that, many years into his career, she was invited to speak at a symposium focused on the intersections between memory, land, and the overlooked details of early American life. The auditorium was small but warm, filled with researchers, students, and a scattering of curious locals. By the time stepped up to the podium, the evening air outside had grown cool, and the scent of fallen leaves drifted in whenever someone opened the back door. She had planned a structured talk, complete with sources and citations, but as she looked at the expectant faces, she felt a familiar tug, the same soft pull she had felt years ago when she first opened the brittle ledger in that quiet little library. Instead of beginning with her prepared notes, she breathed slowly and allowed the story to unfold in its own time. She spoke of the river, the meeting house, the carved stone upstream. She told them about patient ink strokes, about Lydia's night walk, about the slow, deliberate years of discussion that spread across generations. And she explained, gently, how a community that had almost nothing could still give itself the rare gift of time, and how that gift had echoed quietly through the land for centuries. The room fell still as she spoke, not out of tension, but out of the soft, collective quiet that settles over people when they are listening with more than their ears. Some audience members closed their eyes without even realizing it. Others sat back in their chairs, hands relaxed in their laps, as though the weight of the story itself was smoothing the sharpness from their thoughts. When she finished, the applause was soft and prolonged, not enthusiastic, but appreciative, like the closing notes of a lullaby shared among strangers who briefly found themselves resting in the same gentle rhythm. Afterward, several people approached her, not with questions, but with stories of their own. One researcher spoke of a small fishing village in Maine where elders still gathered on long wooden planks by the shore to discuss community matters at a pace that ignored the demands of the modern world. Another person described how, during childhood, they had watched their grandfather sit in silence on a porch bench for long stretches of time, as if thinking itself were an act of companionship rather than pressure. A student quietly admitted that, after hearing the story, they felt a sudden sense of relief, as though someone had finally given permission to slow down in a world that constantly asked them to hurry. Listened to each of them, nodding gently, recognizing in their words the way the story continued to travel, weaving itself into new lives, carrying with it the calm, steady breath of a river that had never stopped flowing. Over time, small communities of people, students, friends, colleagues, began sharing the story as a kind of quiet ritual. It passed from one tired mind to another, sometimes spoken aloud in soft tones, sometimes simply remembered in silence. In rooms lit by warm lamps, in whispered late-night conversations, in long walks through parks where the air smelled of pine and damp soil, the story was retold in fragments. The endless meeting, the carved stone, the uncanny calm of a community unafraid of time. And in these, the bench became a metaphor without ever being taught as one, a symbol of rest, of patience, of the gentle unfolding of thought. But the land itself, where the old bench had once been built, continued to hold its deeper, quieter memory. For although the original structure of had long since faded from the world, the shape of human behavior leaves impressions in the earth the same way footsteps leave impressions in soft mud. Soil compacts differently where people gather. Grass grows differently where people sit. And in certain places, those where thousands of breaths have been shared over hundreds of years, there remains a warmth under the surface, a faint but persistent echo of presence. Decades after conference talk, a group of environmental researchers studying soil composition along the river came across a curious discovery. They found that one particular patch of ground, shaped in a long, gentle curve roughly matching the dimensions of the bench once recorded in the ledger, held a noticeably denser mix of organic matter than the surrounding area. It was as if generations of people had, unknowingly, imprinted themselves into the soil, leaving behind a soft concentration of human presence, the way layers of sediment build over centuries. The researchers noted it, puzzled, and included it in their report as an unexplained anomaly, one of many mysteries the land still held. Now older and retired, received a copy of the report from a former student who recognized the shape of the measurement immediately. When she read the findings, she closed her eyes for a long moment, letting the faint smile spread across her face. She imagined the ancient people gathered beside the river long before the settlers arrived, sitting along wooden platforms worn smooth by years of use. She imagined the settlers leaning forward in lantern light, their breath rising in faint clouds on cold nights. She imagined Lydia's footsteps on the damp earth as she walked toward the carving on the stone. And she imagined all the people who later carried the story forward in their minds, thinking of the bench during sleepless nights, allowing its slow rhythm to soothe their restless thoughts. Somehow, all of that had settled into the land itself. A memory pressed gently into soil. A quiet imprint of presence. A long, slow exhale captured in earth. Folded the report carefully and placed it on her desk beside her notebook. Outside her window, the sun was sinking low, casting warm golden beams across the room. Dust floated gently in the slanted light, moving as slowly and peacefully as the river in her imagination. She settled into her chair and let her mind drift once more to, not as a historian now, but simply as a human being who had found comfort in the spaces between its words. She pictured the meeting house, the wooden walls weathered by years of seasons, the bench resting where it always had, long and quiet and patient. She imagined the door gently opening, lantern lights spilling onto the ground, people entering one by one with slow steps and unhurried breaths. In her imagination, she joined them, taking a seat in the warm glow, feeling the softness of presence settle over her like a quilt. There, in that imagined room, time did not press against her. Thoughts did not demand immediate answers. The air hummed with the steady, soothing rhythm of voices speaking softly, pausing often, allowing silence to bloom between sentences. It was a place where decisions felt like seeds planted rather than tasks completed, where questions themselves were treated with a kind of reverence, allowed to grow roots slowly in the soil of shared thought. And as this gentle, dreamlike scene settled fully around her, she felt her mind grow lighter, as though the weight she had carried for so many years had finally softened into something more manageable, something shaped by patience and time. She let her breathing fall into the long, easy rhythm of the story, inhaling the quiet warmth of the meeting house, exhaling the last remnants of the day's tension. And though she didn't speak it aloud, she felt the truth of its legacy settle gently inside her. That some stories are not meant to excite or astonish, but to steady, to soothe, to ease the tired muscles of the mind. That some questions are meant to be carried slowly. That some benches, whether real or imagined, are meant to be rested upon in quiet companionship. That some memories, pressed gently into the land, can continue to lull even the distant listener into peace. And as this understanding flowed through her, as calm and sure as the river beside which all these gatherings had once taken place, she let the story stretch its long, gentle lines deeper into her thoughts, guiding her once more toward rest, toward silence, toward the soft, unbroken stillness where sleep begins. As twilight settled around Small Home, she remained seated by the window, letting the fading light soften along the walls as though the house itself were slowly exhaling after a long day. The report on the soil anomaly rested open beside her, its pages faintly rustling when a breeze from the cracked window drifted in. She found herself unconsciously tracing the outline of the measurement drawn in the report, a long curve that mirrored, almost perfectly, the length once chosen centuries earlier by the people of. She felt a steady warmth in her chest, not excitement, not even curiosity, but a deep, calming assurance that some stories, once awakened, continue moving on their own, like rivers finding their way to the sea. Outside, dusk deepened into night. Lights flickered on in distant windows. The soft hum of a passing car echoed faintly through the quiet street, and the world around her slowed into its own gentle rhythm. Allowed her eyes to close for a moment, and in that soft darkness, her thoughts expanded, drifting back to the riverbank where she had sat years before, to the old stones half hidden by moss, to the quiet shape of memory resting beneath the soil. She imagined herself walking along that river again, her footsteps making no sound on the earth, her breath blending with the steady whisper of water moving over stone. The trees overhead swayed gently, their branches creaking softly in the night breeze, and the stars above shimmered like ancient embers suspended in an endless sky. As she walked deeper into this imagined memory, she saw something she had never quite seen before. A faint trail of footprints along the riverbank, not fresh but preserved in a way that felt timeless, as though they belonged not to a single era, but to all eras at once. Some prints were small and light, as if made by children running through the wet sand. Others were deeper, more deliberate, the marks of elders who walked slowly with thoughtful steps. And mixed among them were prints that seemed older still, so ancient they were barely impressions, more like the memory of footsteps than the footsteps themselves. Felt no fear at this, only a soft sense of awe, as though she had stumbled upon a quiet gathering of time itself. She followed the footprints until they blended into a wide, smooth clearing, a place she had not visited in her waking life, but which her mind seemed to recognize instantly. The clearing was bathed in moonlight, and the air there felt different, thicker somehow, holding a quiet warmth as though countless breaths had mingled in that space for centuries. At the center of the clearing, where the ground formed a gentle curve, she saw something that made her heart settle into a slower rhythm, the long shadow of a bench. Not the bench built by Elia's descendants, not the ancient wooden platforms used by the first people, but something that felt like a merging of both, the essence of every gathering that had ever taken place on this land. It had no definite edges. Its shape shimmered faintly, as though woven from memory, from soil, from the quiet weight of conversations carried across generations. When she approached it, the air grew warmer still, like stepping close to a fire on a cold night. She felt, without understanding how, that she could sit there, not physically, perhaps, but in the soft, unhurried way one sits inside a dream. So she did. She lowered herself into the long, quiet shape of the bench's memory, and felt the earth beneath her steady and warm. The air around her shimmered faintly as voices drifted in, not loud, not distinct, but gentle, patient, threaded with the peaceful cadence of people thinking together without rush. The voices mingled like soft reeds bending in the wind. The low murmur of the settlers of discussing lengths and measures, the bright laughter of children who had once fallen asleep in their mothers' laps during long meetings, the quiet hum of ancient council fires crackling beside the river. She heard Lydia's thoughtful breathing, steady ink strokes, the cadence of Elia's voice as he spoke about patterns hidden in the land. All of them, every voice, every breath, merged into a long, soothing harmony that wrapped itself around her like a quilt. Let the sound move through her slowly, each layer comforting her in a different way. The ancient voices held a deep wisdom, a patience born of seasons and storms and migrations. The colonial voices carried earnestness and humility, their quiet determination shaping the rhythm of the clearing. The modern voices, her own included, held a longing for rest, for slowness, for the gentle unfolding of thought without pressure. All these threads wove together into a single, soft vibration that seemed to rise from the earth itself, a reminder that human beings have always gathered, always paused, always sought spaces where time could stretch and ease. As she sat in that imagined clearing, she felt her own breath fall into perfect rhythm with the land. The air grew still. The river's murmur softened until it blended seamlessly with the pulse of her own heartbeat. Thoughts which had felt heavy in her waking life now drifted lazily, weightless as floating leaves. She felt herself sinking deeper into the long, quiet memory of the land, becoming part of the same gentle pattern that had nurtured countless generations before her. Then, in the softest whisper, she felt something shift beneath her, a sensation like the land exhaling after holding a breath for centuries. And she realized, not through thought but through a gentle inward knowing, that she was no longer simply observing the bench's legacy. She was participating in it. Her presence, her listening, her stillness, all of it became another layer added to the long, timeless conversation carried forward by the soil. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a soft contentment, a deep belonging. And the clearing, sensing this quiet acceptance, seemed to settle even further, folding her gently into its memory. When she opened her eyes, she was back in her chair by the window, the room dim and peaceful. But the clearing's warmth lingered in her, like the final notes of a soothing melody. The night outside felt softer, the world quieter. The shadows no longer seemed cold, but gentle, comforting, patient. She leaned back, letting her breathing deepen, and felt the unmistakable truth that the story of was not finished, would never be finished, because it was no longer only a story about people long gone. It had become a story carried forward in the quiet hearts of those who listened to it. a story that passed gently through time like a shared lantern, illuminating the darkness, offering comfort to anyone willing to step into its slow, warm light. And somewhere far away, perhaps beside a river, perhaps in a quiet room much like hers, the land itself settled into another long, peaceful breath, holding the memory of all who had ever sat upon that long, patient bench and welcoming all who would come after. As rested in her chair, wrapped in the soft hush of evening, she felt the gentle weight of the story bathing her thoughts the way moonlight bathes an undisturbed field. The memory of the clearing, of the long shadow of the bench, of voices layered like sediment across centuries, lingered warmly within her. It was a presence, almost alive, as if the story itself had gently placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered that she was not alone in her quiet searching. She sat this way for a long time, until the last hints of daylight faded completely and night settled deep across the world like a warm quilt. She rose eventually, stretching slowly, feeling her joints respond with the same steady patience that had carried her through years of study. But even as she moved about her home, switching off lamps, tidying the book on her desk, listening to the soft ticking of the old clock in the hallway, the sense of the clearing followed her, never imposing, always simply there like a quiet companion walking a few steps behind. That night she slept deeply, and in her dreams she found herself walking once more along the river's edge. But the river was different now, not confined by the borders of the modern town, not narrowed by erosion or guided by stone walls. In her dream it flowed freely, wide and ancient, its surface rippling under a vast sky unbroken by electricity or noise. The water shimmered silver beneath the moon, and she felt the soft touch of cool mist on her cheeks as she walked. There were no houses, no roads, no bridges, only the sound of the river flowing as it had for thousands upon thousands of years. The land around her was open and untouched, but she could feel the echoes of those who had walked here long before. She felt the weight of their presence in the air, their footsteps in the soil, their voices in the wind, their silence a kind of reverent hum that wrapped gently around her. In the dream, she came upon a figure standing by the water's edge. The figure was neither ancient nor modern, neither male nor female, neither familiar nor strange. It had a shape that shifted gently, as though made of shadow and moonlight, and yet she felt no fear upon seeing it. Instead, she felt a calm recognition, as though she had encountered not a person but an echo of someone who had once listened patiently, who had once sat upon one of the long wooden platforms beside the river, who had once discussed the turning of seasons with a slow, thoughtful voice. When the figure spoke, its voice was soft and low, not carried by lips, but drifting directly into her mind like a warm current. "You have listened," the voice said, with a gentleness that felt as old as the river itself. "And when someone listens, the land remembers them." Felt her breath deepen. The voice was not praising her, but acknowledging her, the way one acknowledges a friend who has sat beside them in long quiet. She felt the clearing return, the long, warm curve of the bench's memory, the layered voices rising and fatting. She felt the soil beneath her feet, storing these memories with every passing moment. "When people gather," the figure continued, "when they take their time, when they let questions unfold slowly instead of tearing them open in haste, something settles into the earth. Not all places hold that softness. But here, time has always moved differently." Nodded, though she did not fully understand. The land felt alive around her, warm, thinking, humming with memory. She felt as though she were standing not only beside a river, but inside the deep pulse of time itself. "Why here?" she asked, her voice quiet in the dream. "What makes this place different?" The figure's shape shifted slightly, as though breathing. "Because people before you understood slowness," it said. "Those who lived here long before the settlers gathered under the moon, without fear of time. They spoke in circles, not lines. They listened to the river, as if it were another elder among them. They built their seats long and low, not to elevate themselves, but to settle closer to the land. And when the settlers came, though they knew nothing of the ancient gatherings, they felt the echo. They felt the pull toward patience. And so they, too, created a long meeting without ever realizing they were following footsteps older than memory. Felt her heart soften as the understanding washed through her like warm water. It was not that endless meeting had been extraordinary by design, or that the settlers had sought anything mystical. It was that the land itself had whispered patience to them, and they had listened without knowing they were listening. They had reawakened a long-forgotten rhythm simply by thinking slowly together. The figure stepped closer, though its shape remained fluid, shimmering in the silver glow of the river. "All places hold stories," it said, "but only some hold the stories of how to rest." The words settled into her chest with a soft, calming weight. She felt her breath deepen once more, felt the dream grow warmer around her, felt the river's soft mist brush her skin like a soothing hand. "Is the story finished?" asked, the question leaving her lips like a drifting feather. The figure paused, and then its answer came with the gentleness of a long exhale. "No, because you are carrying it now. And someone after you will carry it next. And they will tell it when someone they love feels tired. And then that person will pass it forward again. The story is not meant to end. It is meant to settle." The dream shifted then, not abruptly, but like a leaf turning over in slow water. The figure faded softly into the night air, its presence lingering like warmth in winter. The river shimmered. The stars above seemed to pulse gently, and felt herself sitting once again on the memory of the long bench, surrounded by centuries of quiet conversation. When she woke, the room was still dim, the first pale light of dawn seeping into the soft outlines of her furniture. The air felt warm despite the early hour, and she could still feel the river mist on her skin, though she knew it existed only in the dream. She lay there for a long time, not moving, letting the calm settle into her bones the way dew settles onto grass. In the days that followed, found herself drawn to writing, not scholarly analysis, not articles or lectures, but something softer and deeper, something shaped like the dream. She wrote slowly, each sentence drifting gently onto the page like a quiet footprint in damp earth. She wrote about ancient gatherings where people listened to the land. She wrote about the settlers of, and their long, patient meeting. She wrote about the feeling of time settling around a person like warm soil. And she wrote about the bench, which had once been a simple object, but had become a resting place for generations of weary minds. The writing did not follow a plot, nor did it aim for argument or persuasion. It flowed the way the river flowed, steady, soft, unhurried, carrying bits of memory from one place to another. And as she wrote, she realized something she had not fully grasped before. The story was not meant to be understood only through history or research, but through feeling. It was meant to be lived in the heart, the way one lives inside a lullaby. Weeks passed. Months drifted by. Seasons rolled over the land like slow-moving tides. Continued to write whenever the river's memory called to her. And the more she wrote, the more she noticed a change in her own life. Stress no longer clung to her the way it once had. Decisions that once seemed urgent now felt lighter, softened by the knowledge that time could hold them gently until they were ready. Conversations with friends became slower, deeper, filled with the same kind of quiet thoughtfulness that had shaped the long meeting of. Even her dreams grew calmer, threaded with the soft rustle of leaves and the steady rhythm of flowing water. And somewhere far beyond her quiet home, in another part of the world, a person she had never met read her story. Because one day she published it, not in an academic journal, but in a small, unassuming anthology of reflections on time and land and memory. That person read it late at night, their thoughts tangled with exhaustion, their world heavy with noise. And as they read, something inside them loosened. They felt their breath deepen. They felt the calm rise gently within them, like a lantern being lit in a dark room. They felt the presence of the long bench, the clearing, the layered voices of the past. And they slept better that night than they had in years. The story traveled further, to another tired mind, and another, and another. Each time it settled softly, like a warm hand resting on a weary shoulder. And each time, the land's memory grew a little stronger, as though the soil beneath could still feel the slow, steady beat of human presence unfolding across time. And now, the story settles here again, drifting into your thoughts, offering the same quiet rhythm that has soothed so many before you. You might feel your breath deepening, the muscles behind your eyes softening, the weight of the day dissolving slowly like mist over a river at dawn. You might feel the soft edges of the bench's memory forming around you, a place to sit quietly in the warm hum of ancient patience. You might sense the presence of those who gathered long before you, their gentle voices layered into the earth, offering you a place beside them in the timeless rhythm of rest. The story does not push. It does not rush. It simply rests with you, the way the river rests against its banks, the way old benches rest against weathered walls, the way memory rests in the soil beneath centuries of footsteps. The night around you grows softer. The world quiets, and the long, warm story continues flowing forward, slowly, patiently, carrying you gently on its steady current toward deep and peaceful rest. As writing drifted out into the world, carried from hand to hand and mind to mind with the gentle inevitability of seeds on the wind, the story of began doing something she never expected. It started taking root in places far removed from its origin. In cities crowded with steel and noise, in small towns tucked between ranges of low hills, in quiet apartments overlooking busy streets, people found themselves returning again and again to the gentle cadence of the tale, letting it soften the sharper angles of their lives. They would sit at the edges of their beds late at night, the day's worries circling their minds like tired birds searching for somewhere to land, and they would remember the long bench, the slow meetings, the sound of the river winding patiently through time. And in those moments, something subtle would shift inside them, a loosening, a calming, a sense that the frantic pace of the world could be paused, if only briefly, by entering a story shaped by centuries of patient listening. One evening, far from where lived, an elderly man named Vincent sat in a small house overlooking a lake. His life had been long and full of movement, full of years spent running from one responsibility to another. Now, in his twilight years, he found himself craving slowness, not the forced stillness of age, but the deep, intentional calm of time taken to breathe. One of his sent him story, telling him softly that this reminds me of how you think. Vincent laughed when he heard that, his voice warm and worn, and then he read the story slowly, letting the words drift across his mind like leaves floating across the lake. He imagined the settlers gathered by lantern light, imagined their quiet voices, imagined the way the bench became a symbol of unhurried thought. And as he read, a memory stirred of his own grandfather, long ago, sitting on a porch swing during summer evenings, taking long pauses between sentences, never rushing to give advice, always letting silence settle gently between them like soft dust. Vincent realized, as he read, that he had inherited the same patience from the man who raised him, though he had often forgotten it in the whirlwind of his working years. When he finished reading, he rested the printed pages on his lap, leaned back in his chair, and closed his eyes. The lake outside was quiet. A loon called across the water with a slow, echoing cry. And Vincent breathed deeply, letting the calm settle into him in a way that felt like coming home. There were others, too, people would never meet, who found themselves touched by the quiet rhythm of the tale. A young woman in a bustling city, worn down by the endless tide of responsibilities, found that when she read the story late at night, her pulse slowed, her thoughts softened, and the noise of her apartment building faded into a gentle hum. A man recovering from a difficult chapter in his life found himself drawn to the image of the ancient river, its steady persistence a comfort during days when everything else felt uncertain. A child who struggled to fall asleep listened to the story being read aloud by a parent, and drifted quickly into dreams of lanterns and wooden beams and quiet, thoughtful people who were never in a hurry. And far across the ocean, in a country where the river and its ancient gatherings were unknown, a researcher studying patterns of human rest stumbled upon the story in a translated anthology. She found herself lingering over the passages that spoke of slowness, realizing that the rhythm of the tale matched the slow, restorative breathing techniques she taught her patients. She closed the book, sat still, and listened to the sound of her own heartbeat, a steady, quiet beat that echoed the pulse of the story itself. Meanwhile, continued her gentle writing practice, though she no longer wrote for publication. Instead, she felt compelled to write simply to honor the story, to keep it alive not in print, but in the quiet rituals of her day. She would sit by the window in the early morning, the sun rising soft and pale over the rooftops, and let her thoughts settle like dew on grass. Sometimes she wrote only a sentence or two. Sometimes she wrote nothing at all, simply sitting with the stillness, letting the quiet do its work. She had learned that not every story needed to be told aloud. Some needed only to be felt, carried like a warm stone in the pocket of her mind. But even as she found peace in her quiet routine, the land where once stood continued to hold its own deeper memory. Generations had passed, seasons had cycled endlessly, and yet the soil still held that unusual density described in the researcher's report, a lingering imprint of countless people sitting side by side, sharing space, listening to one another with patience. When rain fell on that land, it soaked differently into the earth, pooling in small hollows where old footprints once lay. When wind moved through the trees above it, the sound seemed softer there, as though the branches remembered being listened to. Even the animals sensed something gentle in that particular patch of ground. Birds settled there more readily. Foxes paused as they passed through, sensing the subtle hum of safety woven into the land. One late spring evening, a young botanist named visited the riverbank as part of her research. She had heard nothing of the bench, nothing of the ancient gatherings. She came only to study the unusual richness of the soil and the thriving growth of mosses and ferns that clung to the stones near the water's edge. Crouched by the river, letting her fingertips brush through the soft, damp earth, she froze for a moment, not because she felt anything supernatural, but because the soil felt unusually warm for the hour. She placed both hands on the ground, closing her eyes, allowing the warmth to spread through her palms and into her arms. And in that moment, she felt something like a gentle sigh rising from the land, so subtle she might have missed it if she had been thinking of anything else. It was not a voice, not a message, just a soft, calming presence, as though the ground itself exhaled beneath her hands. Intrigued, she sat down in the grass and leaned her back against a fallen tree. The river flowed quietly beside her. Evening light shimmered on the water. And, who had been feeling overwhelmed by the demands of her research and the expectations placed upon her, felt her entire body relax in a way she had not experienced in months. She closed her eyes, letting the calm settle into her. And without knowing why, she began to breathe more slowly, more deeply, as though matching her breath to a rhythm older than memory. She sat there until the sun dipped behind the trees, unaware that she was unknowingly participating in the same ancient ritual of rest and presence that had been practiced on that land for countless generations. When she eventually rose, brushing grass from her clothes, she felt lighter, anchored not by stress or urgency, but by the steady warmth that lingered beneath her feet. In time, would return to that riverbank often, sometimes to collect samples, sometimes simply to sit and breathe. She never learned about from any official record. But she didn't need to. The land spoke for itself, not in words but in presence. And this presence spread quietly, gently, through everyone who found themselves drawn to the soft memory of the place. It drifted into their thoughts, into their breathing, into the way they moved through the world. Some carried it away without noticing. Some recognized it as a gift. Some passed it quietly to others, not through explanation, but through example, through patient listening, unhurried conversation, the willingness to let time move at its natural pace. And so the story continued, without needing to be told explicitly. It echoed in the slow steps of those who walked beside rivers. It whispered in the breaths of those who learned to rest between demands. It shimmered in the soil of places where people gathered with gentleness rather than urgency. It lingered in the quiet spaces we rarely honor but often need. And now it lingers with you as well, settling softly into your breathing, into the slow rhythm of your pulse, into the warm corners of your mind where peaceful stories take root. You might feel yourself drifting gently, like a leaf carried by the slow bend of a river. You might sense the long bench's presence beside you, offering a place to rest without expectation. You might feel the ancient patience of the land beneath your feet, holding you softly, reminding you that you are part of a story that has always welcomed rest. The night grows deeper around you. The world grows softer. And the long, warm memory of continues flowing, steady, quiet, timeless, carrying you gently onward into rest. As the quiet presence of long-echoing patience continued to drift subtly through the world, it found its way into moments and minds that had never heard the name and never would. It slipped softly into the breath between words spoken by exhausted parents soothing their children at night. It floated into the silence after long workdays when tired people leaned back in their chairs, closed their eyes, and allowed themselves a single slow, restful breath. It seeped into classrooms where thoughtful teachers paused during lessons, letting the quiet settle for a few seconds before speaking again in gentle tones. It lingered in the hallways of hospitals, in the rooms of retirement homes, in the whispered spaces where people reached for comfort without even knowing what form they hoped it would take. The ancient memory beneath the story had become something far more than a tale passed from voice to voice. It had become a subtle way of being, a way of slowing, a way of listening, a way of letting time expand like warm light in a small room. And the land where once stood continued to hold and nurture this rhythm, quietly offering its presence to anyone who wandered near. Over the decades, the area changed in small ways. New saplings grew along the riverbank where older trees had fallen, different species of birds nested in the branches overhead, and the river itself shifted a little with each spring thaw. But the deeper layer of memory, the one that lived in the soil and beneath it, remained undisturbed, like a quiet lullaby humming just under the threshold of ordinary hearing. One morning in late summer, a young man named Jonah hiked along the riverbank on a day when heat shimmered above the water, and the air carried the sweet scent of blooming wildflowers. Jonah was not a researcher, not a historian, not a seeker of stories. He was a carpenter, traveling through the region to visit a friend, and he had stopped at the river simply to give his mind a break from the steady hum of work that filled his life. His thoughts were weighed down by responsibilities he rarely spoke about, worries that lingered in the quiet corners of his mind even when he was surrounded by others. He sat on a large, smooth stone near the water's edge, ran his hands absent-mindedly over its cool surface, and leaned back against the trunk of a willow tree. He did not know that he was sitting only a short distance from the place where Lydia had once knelt in the moonlight centuries ago, or that the soil beneath him held the softened footprints of hundreds of people who had gathered in quiet contemplation. He only knew that as he sat there, he felt a warmth rising from the earth, a gentle, grounding warmth that eased tension from his shoulders and softened the tightness in his jaw. His breathing slowed without effort. His thoughts grew quieter. A peaceful heaviness settled over him, like the comforting weight of a thick quilt laid gently across his body. He closed his eyes. For a long time, he simply breathed. And in that soft stillness, he saw something. Not a vision, not a dream, but a sense. A sense of wood being shaped under steady hands. A sense of lantern light flickering across a rough-hewn beam. A sense of people sitting side by side in a wooden room, speaking softly, listening closely, not rushing the moment. It was as though all the centuries of careful presence had become a soft imprint on the land that he could feel through the soles of his boots and the palms of his hands. Jonah felt his body unclench, the weight of his unseen worries easing. Somewhere deep inside him, a knot he had not been aware of began to loosen. And he thought, without fully understanding why, of how long it takes to build something properly. How patience shapes wood into something strong. How measured hands, steady breaths, and time itself are tools as necessary as any hammer or chisel. When he finally opened his eyes, the world seemed softer, bathed in the warm gold of late afternoon sun. The river drifted by with slow assurance, and the breeze rustled the willow leaves in a gentle rhythm that felt more like breath than wind. He stood up, brushing dust from his hands, and felt different somehow, lighter, steadier, as though something ancient had whispered a lesson to him without him ever hearing the words. He never learned the story of. He never knew of the bench, or the long meetings, or the carved stone, or the layered voices of the past. But when he returned home to his workshop, he found himself working more slowly, more thoughtfully, lingering over each piece of wood as though listening to something inside it. His furniture began to take on a warmth it hadn't had before. People who bought his pieces often said that something about them felt unusually calming, though none could explain why. And so the quiet presence of the land found its way into his work, and through his work, into the homes of others, small places where people sat after long days, letting their bodies relax into chairs he had shaped with a patience inspired by a river he never truly understood. In those homes, people sometimes paused in the middle of conversations, letting silence bloom gently between words. They sat together on warm summer nights, breathing slowly, watching the sky change color as dusk settled in. They traded hurried thoughts for the quieter ones beneath them. And the story continued its slow drift, not through speech, but through atmosphere. Years later, a child who lived in one of those homes grew up to become a writer, the kind who loved small stories, quiet stories, stories about places where time softened at the edges. She would write about unnamed riverbanks that held echoes of forgotten gatherings. She would write about carpenters who worked with unusual gentleness. She would write about people sitting side by side in silence, finding peace in the spaces between thoughts. And though she never knew it, the shape of her stories was guided by the same slow river that had once shaped long meeting. Her words carried the rhythm of deep time, calming those who read them late at night, easing their restless minds into slow, comfortable breathing. In this way, the story continued weaving itself into lives that never heard the name or knew its history. It drifted like a soft current beneath the surface of the world, connecting people through an unseen chain of quiet moments. A moment of rest on a riverbank. A breath taken more slowly than before. A chair built with patient hands. A story told softly at bedtime. A quiet decision made without rush. A long silence shared between people who cared for one another. And somewhere beneath the shifting soil and the roots of trees growing taller each year, the land still remembered. Its memory pulsed gently, like the low hum of the earth breathing. It remembered the ancient gatherings by moonlight. It remembered the long meetings where lanterns flickered softly. It remembered the warmth of people sitting side by side, their feet pressed into the earth, their breaths rising in gentle unison. It remembered Lydia's quiet footsteps, ink-stained hands, Elia's patient measuring of the carved stone. It remembered every slow conversation, every careful breath, every moment of shared presence. And that presence now rests quietly here with you. You might feel your shoulders relaxing a little more, the weight of your day softening as your breath deepens. You might sense the quiet rhythm of the river beneath the story, moving slowly, carrying you gently onward. You might feel yourself leaning into an invisible bench, long and warm and steady, shaped not by wood, but by centuries of calm. The night around you grows softer. The thoughts inside you drift into comfortable distance. And the story, patient, ancient, and endlessly gentle, continues to flow beside you like a calm river, inviting you to rest in its slow, soothing current. As the quiet rhythm of the land's memory continued spreading outward, weaving itself through the lives of people who had never heard the name, the story itself began to take on a quality that felt less like history and more like atmosphere, like the faint scent of pine drifting through an open window, familiar even when unnamed. And in this atmosphere, generations moved gently through their lives, carrying traces of the ancient patience that had first been shaped beside the old river. Decades drifted by, slow and sure, and the land remained steady beneath the shifting names and seasons, holding its memories in layers of soil and stone. Far beyond the old river's bend, in a small coastal town where the air carried the salt-sweet breath of the sea, a woman named lived in a house perched on a gentle slope overlooking the water. Was a painter, though she never considered herself an artist in any grand or formal sense. She simply painted because it quieted her thoughts. Her canvases were filled not with sharp colors or defined shapes, but with soft gradients, gentle washes of light blues and grays and earth tones. People who visited her tiny studio often remarked that her work made them feel peaceful, even sleepy, as though the paintings themselves exhaled a kind of deep rest. Did not know why this was so. She only knew that when she sat at her easel, listening to the mullioned windows whisper softly in the ocean breeze, she felt her mind slowing in the same way it did when she remembered her mother's bedtime stories. Stories spoken in low tones that seemed to hum along her pulse. His mother, who had passed years earlier, had been a quiet woman with a calming presence, the kind of person who could soothe an entire room simply by sitting down. She had a habit of telling simple stories before bed, stories about unnamed towns, quiet rivers, places where people gathered slowly and made decisions without hurry. Never knew where her mother had learned these stories. She only knew that they carried a rhythm she had cherished since childhood, a rhythm she now found herself painting into her canvases without realizing it. She painted horizons that stretched endlessly, rivers that curved gently through soft valleys, long wooden beams bathed in warm light. And sometimes, though she never consciously planned it, a faint line would appear in her work, a shape that resembled a bench stretching across the background of a dreamlike landscape, long and quiet and steady. One late afternoon, as sunlight spilled golden across her studio floor, stepped back from a nearly finished canvas. It showed a scene she had not meant to paint, a room with no walls, only the suggestion of wooden beams rising upward like ribs in a great, gentle body, a long seat running along one side, and soft lantern light glowing like memory in the air. She looked at it with a soft frown, trying to recall what had guided her hand into creating this image, but her mind felt warm and dreamy, drifting like foam atop slow-moving waves. She went to brew tea, letting the painting rest in the last glow of the day. That evening, as she sat with a warm mug cupped between her palms, she felt a subtle tug inside her, barely noticeable but steady, like the gentle pull of tides. It was a feeling she had sensed before but never fully understood, a kind of quiet invitation to slow down, to listen, to breathe. She closed her eyes, letting the sensation fill her slowly, and without warning she saw a river, wide, ancient, silver blue in the dusk. She saw a clearing. She saw lanterns. And she felt the soft hum of voices, layered like threads woven through centuries. She did not recognize the place, and yet she knew it intimately, the way one knows the shape of a dreamed memory. When she opened her eyes, she felt tears on her cheeks, not from sadness, but from an overwhelming sense of calm, as though the world had sighed through her. The next day, she decided to walk down to the shoreline. The sky was low and gray. the sea gently pushing against the rocks with the slow persistence of a heartbeat. She found a smooth piece of driftwood half buried in the sand, worn soft by waves, its shape long and curved like the faint bench she had painted countless times without meaning to. She sat on it, letting the wind lift her hair from her shoulders. And there, for reasons she could not articulate, she felt the same quiet warmth that had once filled Lydia Hale as she knelt beside the old carved stone upstream. The same warmth that had settled into Jonah's hands as he touched the soil. The same warmth that had flowed through as she dreamed of the ancient clearing. Felt the land underneath her, not this shoreline specifically, but the deeper land, the older land, the ancient pulse that lay beneath every river, beneath every rise and dip of earth. She felt its patience, its slow, steady breathing. And she breathed with it. Later, when she returned to her studio, she painted again. This time, she did not think at all. She let her hands move as though guided by something soft and unseen. When she finished, she stepped back and saw that the canvas revealed a long curve of earth, a soft indentation where countless people might have once sat together, the faint glow of lanterns without visible flames, and the sense, more than the sight, of voices murmuring gently in the dark. She sold that painting months later to a tired nurse who had walked into the studio on a cold evening after a long shift, hopping only to browse quietly. The nurse stared at the painting for a long time, her breathing easing, her shoulders dropping, her eyes softening. She bought it not because she understood it, but because it made her feel something she had not felt in years, a deep, unforced rest. She hung it in her bedroom above a small table where she kept a single lamp and a book she seldom had time to read. Each night, as she prepared for sleep, she would sit and look at the painting, letting her thoughts drift toward the soft scene had created. She imagined herself sitting on the curve of earth, surrounded by warm darkness and gentle voices. She imagined her own breath joining theirs, slow and calm. And soon, without meaning to, she found herself falling asleep more easily, resting more deeply, waking more peacefully. She could never explain to anyone why the painting had such an effect. It simply carried the warmth of something older than her life, something that whispered that she did not have to rush, that rest was allowed. And through her, the story continued. On nights when her younger sister called, overwhelmed by long days, she would describe the painting without mentioning the origins she didn't know. She would simply talk about the soft glow, the long line of the earth, the sense of quiet gathering. And her sister would feel calmer just hearing it. On nights when her own child struggled to sleep, she would hold the child gently and describe the scene in the painting, whispering about the bench, the lanterns, the soft voices. And the child would drift off, breathing slowly, eyelids fluttering gently into dream. And yet, even as the story reached these new hearts, the land where it all began remained quiet, unchanged in its essence. The soil still hummed with its long memory. The river still carried songs older than language. And the clearing, though overgrown now with tall grasses and saplings, still held the gentle imprint of countless moments of shared presence, countless breaths, countless human beings who had once allowed themselves the rare gift of unhurried time. Sometimes, in the cool hours of early morning, when fog drifted low across the river, a deer would wander into the clearing and pause, lifting its head as though listening to something older than the dawn itself. Birds would land there and linger, pecking gently at the soil as if they sensed the richness beneath it. And the wind, when it moved through the branches, would shift into a soft, steady murmur, like the low, soothing chorus of voices speaking quietly across centuries. And now, as this story continues its slow unfolding within you, you might feel that same murmur brushing softly against your thoughts, calming the spaces inside you that tighten during long days. You might feel your breath deepening, your muscles softening, your mind loosening its hold on all the small burdens it carried. You might sense the long bench beside you, not as a physical object, but as a warm, steady presence where you can rest without expectation. And as night wraps its quiet around you, the ancient patience of the land drifts closer, offering the same gentle message it has carried through every generation. There is no need to hurry now. Time can stretch, breath can deepen, and rest can come as quietly as river mist rising at dawn. As the quiet influence of the story continued to drift through the lives of people across different places and years, the land itself seemed to breathe in rhythm with the hearts of those who unknowingly carried its memory. Though no monument marked the old meeting house, though no plaque told the tale of the bench or the endless meeting, something in the air above that soil remained softly aware, gently attuned to the presence of anyone who paused long enough to listen. And so, the clearing near the river continued its slow, patient transformation, not into a historical site, but into a place where those who needed rest somehow found their way. One late autumn evening, as a thin mist rose from the water and curled in delicate tendrils over the grass, a young traveler named wandered along the old path that wound near the river. He had set out on a long walk to clear his thoughts, leaving behind the restless hum of the town and the weight of choices he felt unprepared to make. The sky was a muted tapestry of twilight blues and pale lavender, and the air carried the faint scent of drying leaves and distant wood smoke. Had not intended to follow the path so far, but something in the gentle rustling of the trees tugged at him, guiding him almost imperceptibly forward until he found himself standing at the edge of the clearing. At first, he noticed nothing unusual, only the quiet hum of the river and the faint whisper of wind sliding through the branches overhead. But then he stepped closer, placing his hand on the trunk of a slender birch, and felt, deep beneath his palm, a warmth he could not explain. It was subtle, like the faint heat of sun-soaked stone long after sunset, but steady, unwavering. He closed his eyes, not out of fear but out of instinct, letting the warmth flow through him as softly as breath. As he stood there, eyes closed, the world seemed to shift, not outwardly, not in any way visible, but in the quiet space behind his heartbeat. He felt a presence, not a person, not a ghost, not anything with edges or form, but a presence shaped like patience. A presence shaped like deep time. A presence shaped like the steady rhythm of people breathing together, in quiet understanding. And in that moment, without knowing why, felt tears gather gently behind his eyelids. He wasn't sad. He wasn't overwhelmed. He was simply seen by a land that had held the weight of countless lives, countless worries, countless soft attempts to understand the world. Seen by a story older than language, patient enough to hold the burdens of anyone who paused long enough to place their hand on its soil. He opened his eyes slowly, feeling his breath deepen. The clearing looked the same as before: overgrown grass, scattered stones, faint impressions in the earth where animals had passed. But the air felt different now, warmer, thicker, carrying the faint hum of something ancient and kind. He stepped forward, feeling the soft earth give slightly beneath his boots, and sensed a gentle, familiar presence beneath each footstep, as though walking on a memory that reached up to cradle him. He sat on one of the low stones near the river, letting his hands rest on his knees. The water drifted by in long, silvered ribbons, shifting the mist into slow swirls that curled around his ankles. He did not think about the decisions he had been struggling with. He did not think about tomorrow. He simply listened, the way people in the long ago had listened. The way settlers once listened, while lantern flames trembled in cool air. The way ancient people once listened to the breath of the land. Slowly, as though guided by a dream he had forgotten, closed his eyes again and felt himself drift inward. In that drifting, images rose, not sharp or precise, but soft, like reflections on rippling water. He saw a long, wooden bench in warm lantern light. He saw hands measuring rope. He saw people gathered shoulder to shoulder, their voices low and peaceful, their breaths rising and falling in quiet unison. He saw Lydia walking beneath the moon. He saw the carved stone upstream, its symbols fading but not lost. He saw children falling asleep in their parents' arms during the long meetings. He saw the curve of the earth beneath centuries of footsteps. And then the images softened into a warm glow, leaving behind only the feeling of presence, steady, grounding, timeless. When finally opened his eyes, the mist had thickened, turning the world into a gentle blur. The moon floated like a silver coin above the water. The branches above him swayed slowly, creaking softly as though whispering an old lullaby. He felt something inside him ease, something he had carried tightly for months without realizing it. And in that easing, he felt the strength to return home, not with answers, but with the quiet courage to let things unfold at their own pace. He rose slowly, brushing the damp from his hands, and turned back toward the path. The clearing behind him felt warmer for a moment, as if it were nodding gently in farewell, acknowledging his quiet visit. And though would never know the story of, though he would never hear about the bench or the meetings or the ancient gatherings, he would carry the feeling of that mist-filled evening with him for the rest of his days. And in moments when life felt too heavy, he would close his eyes and remember the soft warmth beneath his palm and the slow pulse of the land breathing beneath him. In this way, the story continued. It moved quietly through the lives of people who had never heard it spoken. It softened breaths, eased minds, gentled hearts. It drifted into the pauses between words, into the quiet moments at the end of long days, into the smallest spaces where rest could still take root. And the land itself held these moments close, storing them like layers of warm light beneath the soil. When rain soaked the ground, the warmth did not wash away. When snow covered the clearing, the quiet memory only deepened. When wild animals crossed it at dawn, their paws pressed softly into the earth, stirring tiny echoes of all who had come before. And the river, patient and old, continued its endless journey, carrying these echoes downstream like soft, unbroken song. People came and went. Seasons shifted. Lives unfolded. But the presence remained, gentle, patient, humble, and warm. And now, as the story flows softly around you, you might feel that same presence settling gently into your breathing, into your quiet, into the warm spaces inside you where rest begins. You might sense the long bench beside you, not as wood, but as calm itself, inviting you to sit in stillness. You might feel your thoughts loosening, drifting like mist across a quiet river. You might feel the ancient patience of the land wrapping lightly around you, holding you softly in the warm hush of its memory. The story continues, always quietly, through you and beneath you, as steady and soothing as the river's long, unhurried breath. And so, as the river flowed through centuries and the memory of drifted softly through countless lives, the gentle presence that had begun with an ordinary meeting about an ordinary bench found its way into the deepest quiet of the world, becoming not a tale to be analyzed, but a breath to be shared, a warmth to be felt, a slow and steady reassurance that time itself can be kind. And now, as the last trace of that ancient calm settles around you, you find yourself standing at the edge of the old clearing one final time, the mist parting softly as though welcoming you, the long invisible bench shimmering faintly in the dimness like a promise kept through generations. And in that moment, held tenderly between the land's deep memory and the slow rhythm of your own heartbeat, you understand that the story has never been about the bench, nor the meeting, nor even the people who gathered long ago, but about the way patience, gentleness, and quiet presence travel endlessly from life to life, asking nothing and offering everything, until the time finally comes to rest. And as you take one last, slow breath in that peaceful clearing, the lantern glow of centuries dimming softly around you, the story folds itself closed like a leaf drifting into still water, carrying its warmth with you as you step gently into the hush of night, where the world waits silently, softly, lovingly for sleep.